Hello, I'm Chris Alvarez, and welcome to Military History Inside Out, brought to you by War Scholar. We talk about military history from ancient to modern times and everything in between. Thanks for listening. I'm speaking with Dr. Richard DiNardo, author of Turning Points, the Eastern Front in 1915, published by Prager, February 2020. Thank you for speaking with me.
Oh, my pleasure.
So first, tell me, how did you get into studying this subject and writing on it?
Well, this is my ninth book on the military history, and most of the publications are on German military history. And so, in the early part of my career, I focused mainly on World War II, and then I did a book. I wrote a book on Germany and coalition warfare in World War II, and the initial part of the first chapter of the book had to involve, obviously, Germany's experience in coalition warfare in World War I. And so that sort of drew my attention to what had been a very underserved subject in World War I historiography, namely the Eastern Front, and in particular the campaigns of a general by the name of August von Mackensen. And he was one half of perhaps the second most famous military marriage in German military history in World War I, behind that of Hindenburg and Ludendorff. Namely Mackensen and his collaboration, which was not for the entire war, for I guess about a year and a half, with Hans von Zagt, who most people will recognize as the head of the post-war Truppenamt in the early Weimar period.
Okay.
And so I did a book on the campaign in Galicia, Breakthrough, and then that was published in 2010. And then 2015, I came out with a book on the invasion of Serbia, which was another campaign engineered by Mackensen and Zagt, called Invasion. And then there was still a lot of things out there on the Eastern Front that were of interest. For example, Second Masurian Lakes, very interesting battle. The whole period in late summer, early fall of 1915, when Hindenburg and Ludendorff make their big effort to try and encircle the Russian West Front, and it comes a cropper. The whole raft of other things. So I decided to do the entirety of the Eastern Front for the entirety of 1915. A very, very interesting year.
Yeah, actually, that leads to a question I was going to ask, which is why you picked that time frame. Is it just basically that's because it's the beginning, or because that time frame was of particular importance compared to all of what happened in the Eastern Front?
Well, arguably, it's the most mobile year in the war, when the forces were still relatively evenly matched. I mean, the Brusilov offensive in 1916 makes some gains, but they're not, in terms of territory, they're not, what you would call major, compared to, let's say, 1915, when the Russians get run completely out of Poland, and they're almost cast out of, and they lose almost all of their gains that they had made against Austria in the first year of the war. And then once Brusilov's offensive stalls and Romania switches sides, then the focus of the action shifts down to Romania, which in itself is a very interesting campaign. There have been some pretty good books about that, and articles about that. And 1917, once the revolution occurs, the Russian army is falling apart at the seams. So even though the Germans are able to occupy large swaths of territory, it's not quite the same as 1915.
How do you choose what to focus on in the book? There's a lot of material, obviously. How do you break it down? What's your what sort of themes do you explore?
It's called Turning Points for a reason, because there are a series of interesting turning points in the war, where the war swung back in a decidedly different direction than had been before. So obviously, the first is the Carpathian Winter War and the fall of Przemysl. I'm sure the pronunciation zealots will crucify me on that. And the fall of that critical fortress, which really produced a serious crisis for the Austro-Hungarian AOK, and probably resulted in the period of closest collaboration between the Austro-Hungarians and the Germans in the war. As one German author put it, it was Gorlice Tarnow was quote their finest hour in terms of coalition warfare.
So could you tell me? So I noticed, I think in the book blurb, it implied, or maybe it said directly, that the Russians sort of didn't plan the campaign properly, that they misjudged where the enemy concentrations might be, or what they had to focus on. Could you address that? And also if you could touch on what sort of, what was the Russian army like at this point, as far as makeup and the kind of weapons, and operationally, how did they conduct themselves?
Well, I think the Russian army does a little bit better than people would give it credit for, and certainly, for example, like at Gorlice, when in Mackensen's initial attack, where the Germans did not have overwhelming artillery superiority, and the Russian forces were reasonably well equipped with things like machine guns, their artillery was going to be weak owing to things like shell shortages. Well, that's a little overblown. They could give the Germans a bloody nose. Likewise, their performance at Second Masurian Lakes was by and large not bad, and then they followed that up immediately with actually a victory over the Germans at Prajnish, which resulted in the taking of prisoner results vary, but I think the low number I've seen was like 17,000 German prisoners, something we don't often think about. Mm-hmm. And then likewise, they're winning the ultimate victory in the Carpathian Winter War, defeating all of Conrad von Hertzendorf's attempts to break through to the besieged fortress of Przemysl, and its fall, which is what caused the crisis. So the Russians tactically could do some good things. Mm-hmm. Their cavalry was fairly skilled, as they found it. Operationally, they couldn't move very quickly, but when they could move in an operational sense, shifting units, that kind of thing, that's what enabled them to really bring Ludendorff and Hindenburg's efforts to encircle the Russian West Front to grief in September of 1915. Mm-hmm. Basically, they were able to transfer an army essentially by rail to the spot where German cavalry penetration had threatened the Russian main supply route. And basically, once the new Second Army was established, it was facing against the German First Cavalry Division. It was no contest. Mm-hmm. Once the Russians launched a properly coordinated attack supported by artillery, they just crushed the cavalry.
Was there much trench warfare on the Eastern Front?
Yeah, in periods. It nothing like the Western Front, where you had these like deep belts of fortified positions with second and third lines, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But nonetheless, there were long periods. For example, during the late winter and once the Second Masurian Lakes fighting had died down, where there was a lot of patrolling. There's a lot of trench warfare. You have raids. All this kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. That goes on. If you read German regimental histories, you get a lot of sense of that.
How about the use of aircraft or poison gas on the Eastern Front?
Poison gas was used first on the Eastern Front in January of 1915 mm-hmm. at an attack at a place called Bolimov, and it was used by Mackensen, then commanding the Ninth Army. And it was a choking agent called, I think it's pronounced Sisal bromide, and it proved to be unsuccessful because the weather conditions were not very suitable mm-hmm. for it. It was very cold, so the gas tended to cling to the ground, did cause some casualties. And what was interesting, the Russians never informed the Allies that the Germans were now using poison gas. The business about aircraft was really critical because basically both sides used aircraft for reconnaissance, and by 1915, I think the Germans had become quite good at things like aerial reconnaissance and everything that goes with it, to include photographic interpretation, that sort of thing, and they were big believers in that. Certainly Machen and Zect were, as were Hindenburg and Ludendorff. Aviation had already played a critical part in Tannenberg in August of 1914, and Hindenburg said, without pilots, there's no Tannenberg, because they gave them the critical information on the movement of the Russian Second Army. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so actually, we are very fortunate in the Bavarian archives. I was able to find an order for aerial reconnaissance during while the 11th Army is preparing for its push to recapture Lemberg, and so the Germans sort of divided it into, if you will, close reconnaissance, which was, I guess, within about 5 miles of the front, and then deep reconnaissance, which is beyond that. And the idea was they provided Machen and Zect with lots of detail about the movements of Russian reserves, that kind of thing. And then what was very interesting was the fact that basically when the pilots returned with their reports, they were to be written up and distributed into 10 copies, which would then be distributed to subordinate units.
I'm speaking with Richard DiNardo, author of Turning Points. You can find more of his books by Googling his name or looking for his books on Amazon. If you like this podcast, Military History Inside Out, please rate it on whatever podcast feed you're listening to it on. Please follow, like, and comment on my website, warscholar.org or militaryhistorypodcast.com, on YouTube at warscholar1945, on Twitter and Facebook at Warscholar, and on Instagram at Chris Alvarez Warscholar. If you like sci-fi, fantasy, and horror, please listen to my podcast Full Contact Nerd, also located at chrisalvarez.com or fullcontactnerd.com. If you like outer space, business, technology, and policy, please listen to my podcast Spacewalks Money Talks, also located at spacewalksmoneytalks.com. Now back to the podcast. Did the Russians have much of an air force?
Not much. They used mainly, French machines mostly. They did have some of their own aircraft, most notably the Ilya Muromets bomber, which was very big and could carry a lot of bombs, but it did require really robust basing facilities, which meant that its employment was kind of confined to a few air bases in the Warsaw area. And once they fell, you had difficulties with that. But the Russians did have reconnaissance machines as well, which did provide critical information to both front and commanders as well as to Stavka.
Can you talk about the terrain and the type of weather the forces were dealing with in the regions where they fought?
Well, in 1915, it varies considerably. Basically, in the northern part of the front, where, for example, you're talking about what today would be called the Baltic states, and the pre-war Russo-German border. You have very swampy areas, heavily forested. The weather was well, I'll talk about the weather in a minute. And then Poland, of course, is relatively flat. Not a lot of features. And then once you get into Galicia, which is southern Poland, and extending into Ukraine, and so on, it gets with the Carpathians, it's very mountainous, with relatively few passes. and it's literally you could look at casualty lists and you'd see so and so, wounded on such a date and then eaten by wolves. A pretty wild place.
Wow.
And I would call your attention to Jack Tunstall's book, Blood on the Snow, which is a very detailed study of the Carpathian Winter War. The weather throughout was pretty awful. Particularly like, for example, when Conrad launched his first Carpathian winter offensive, the temperature was like 26 degrees below 0 centigrade, which is about, I think something like somewhere like 4 degrees below 0, and with a serious snowstorm involved. Troops having to wade through like chest-high snow. And actually, on the northern part of the front, during Second Masurian Lakes, the weather was uniformly awful. The attack starts off accompanied by, as one Corps commander put it, a furious snowstorm. And it was very interesting, German soldiers, for camouflage, since they were still operating on Prussian territory, were using every bedsheet and tablecloth from every restaurant and hotel they could lay their hands on. For camouflage. And the weather was, again, it was largely near or in some cases below 0 Fahrenheit. And so a lot of times you had to get around by sled. And I've seen pictures of horses towing broken down automobiles, which is kind of interesting.
Does it get very hot during the or did it get very hot during the summer?
Yes.
In 1950?
Yes, it does. Russia is that part of the world is a land of climatic extremes. We're all familiar with how cold, for example, winters can be in that area. Well, summers can be pretty hot too. So you get into July, August, it can get pretty warm. And so that's something we don't think about, and the impact that has, for example, on horses, as does winter. So therefore, like periods of trench warfare were actually welcomed by the troops because, for example, that meant you had a chance to kind of give your horses some rest and, proper care, feeding, that kind of thing, which is very difficult to do during, let's say, active operations.
Did either side have any major supply issues in 1950 in either food, water, or armaments and that sort of thing?
Well, by the time you get to basically, armies had what you would call a range limit, an operational range limit. Once you got to about 80 miles from your railhead, you had to stop until the railroad could be brought forward. And then you could start restocking. The biggest item, of course, was artillery ammunition because it's very bulky. Although being able at times to supply fodder for horses could also be problematic. But generally, in that regard, the Germans were much better served by the fact that their rail system was much better served. With the Russians, there was some confusion over authority, especially in the occupied areas of Austria. And the Russians made no real effort to overcome the gauge barrier. Russian railways ran on I think a 5-foot gauge. In Germany, Austria-Hungary used the standard European gauge, which is 4 feet 8.5 inches.
So I would imagine that generally each side tried to capture the railroads of the other side rather than destroy them because they could use them themselves. Is that correct?
Yeah. Well, first of all, you would try and capture railroads, and then obviously you'd have to relay the tracks to be able to to your gauge, unless you were fortunate to capture a large amount of rolling stock, which was rarely the case. So basically, the German railway section of the general staff was heavily involved in these sorts of things, and that's a very labor-intensive business.
Mm-hmm.
It requires a lot of people to actually pick up and relay rails,
mm-hmm.
and so on. So you wouldn't necessarily destroy the tracks because they'd be used in the future.
Did either side were they using their troops for this sort of thing, or was there a lot of use of civilian labor on either side?
They used troops. I know, for example, there was, in the run-up to the invasion of Serbia, the original commander of the the Austro-Hungarian army that was going to be involved in the campaign, which was, if I remember correctly, the third, was essentially replaced because he had run afoul of regulations concerning the use of civilian labor or something like that for military purposes, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
What was interesting was, although this has not been adequately researched, it's a good question to ask whether or not prisoners were used in that kind of thing as well. Because I know, for example, that again for the invasion of Serbia, each of the divisions of the Russian forces that were being pulled from the Russian front for the invasion of Serbia, like Robert Koch's 10th Corps,
mm-hmm.
had 200 Russian prisoners assigned to each division as teamsters to drive wagons.
Okay. That's interesting. That's depending a lot on enemy prisoners of war.
Yeah, and of course both sides tried to raise units from disaffected ethnic minorities.
Okay. People just switching sides because they didn't like who they were fighting for.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there were several instances where Czech regiments, shall we say, behaved badly, surrendering to the Russians, and then the Russians were able to raise a Czech legion, which became a very interesting element in the anti-Bolshevik forces during the Civil War.
How about motor transport? How much did each side have and depend on that?
Not a great deal. Part of the problem is that the not a lot of roads for use,
mm-hmm.
And so motorized transport was really kind of limited to heavier items, for example, like heavy guns, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
They required motorized transport to bring forward. But other than that, not a great. The horses remain and would remain the principal mode of transport, certainly in the German army, even through the Second World War. Most people don't realize that 70% of the German army's transport in the Second World War was horse-drawn.
So I guess in 1915, then most of the troops basically might have taken the railroad close to the front and then marched their way to the front, and then
exactly
just
right.
on foot.
And usually during periods when they were assembling for an offensive, for example, like Gorlice-Tarnów, they would only move at night to try and then lay up during the day,
mm-hmm.
To keep away from the prying eyes of the occasional Russian reconnaissance aircraft.
Mm-hmm.
And then, interestingly enough, in the case of the Germans, like a place like Gorlice, when officers went forward to do like ground reconnaissance for the coming attack, they would wear Austrian uniforms, or at least maybe like Austrian caps, because the Pickelhaube was a dead giveaway.
Yeah. So I think the book also mentioned, or the blurb, the description said you also go into some naval issues.
Unfortunately, that kind of fell out because of contract limitations. I'm limited to like 100,000 words, which I violated.
Yeah.
And so obviously there were some issues, some things that had to fall out, and regrettably telling the naval story
mm-hmm.
Was one of them.
Okay.
Because there is a lot of interesting stuff, and again, that's a subject worthy of exploration, because beyond the German official history and maybe one or two things in German, there might be something out there in Russian.
Mm-hmm.
And there's part of a very good book by James Goldrick called Before Jutland,
mm-hmm.
which looks at the naval war in European waters up to Jutland.
Mm-hmm.
He does have a section in there on what's going on in the Baltic. There's not a whole lot written about it. The German Navy did support things like the German Army's advance in the port of Libau,
mm-hmm.
and so on. And there was some naval action between light units. There's a lot of mining going on, that sort of thing. But regrettably, I simply just did not have the space to give the coverage that I would have liked to naval matters.
So earlier you had mentioned some lakes, so I'm curious about how much did rivers and other waterways affect what was going on there in 1915?
Well, in terms of waterways, now, it's very interesting. If you're dealing with, let's say, the early part of the campaign, 1915, you're dealing with some key rivers. One is the San River. Another one, of course, is the Vistula. And then for the on the northern part of the front, you're dealing with a couple of very swampy watercourses, the Niemen River and the Narew River.
Mm-hmm.
And then once you get through Poland, you reach the Bug, which runs roughly north-south. And then beyond the Bug, that marks the eastern edge of the Pripyat marshes, which really then clearly divides the front into a northern front and a southern front with the marshes in between, which is centered around the Pripyat River, which is this very kind of sluggish waterway surrounded by this enormous swamp with very, very few trails, roads of any kind. And that would remain a key planning factor in both world wars.
Okay. So let's turn to the resources you used for your research. You mentioned, I guess, the archives in Bavaria. I believe you mentioned that. What other archives and information did you gather?
Well, let's see. Each one serves a separate purpose. I used the Bavarian archives are very, very useful because a lot of German military records from the imperial period did not survive the Second World War. Basically, Bomber Command at Arthur Harris's direction launched a fire raid against the archives in Potsdam. And so a lot of records were destroyed. Now, the Russians collected a number of records that we thought had been destroyed, and these are available online, thanks to the efforts of the German Historical Institute working with the Russian archives. And you can actually access them online. Just Google German documents in Russia, and then it'll take you to the website, which is both in German and Russian.
Okay.
And then there's a lot of hunting and pecking. You got to look around for what they had. There's no real what you would call index, but you did come up with some interesting things. And so those are documents that are still in Russian archives, in Moscow or in the Russian military archive in Podolsk. But they're German documents. So that was one thing. Imperial Germany had several different military establishments. There was the Prussian military establishment, which had its separate war ministry, of course, and which also served as the imperial war ministry for the German Empire. Bavaria and Württemberg also had separate war ministries and military establishments, which kind of folded in under the imperial auspices when the balloon went up. The Bavarian records survived, and so if you have an organization, an operation where Bavarian units are involved, the Bavarian archive in Munich, which does have an excellent online finding aid, those records are there. They're in Munich, and so they can provide a lot of detail. Including higher unit orders, that kind of thing, which would have been the original, the German copies of which for the Imperial German Archive would have been lost. Likewise, Württemberg, Baden-Württemberg, the Landesarchiv also has an excellent online finding aid. And so if you have a Württemberg or Badenese unit that was involved in the operation, you could find those records. And I did business with them for the Serbia book by mail. They were very, very helpful. Mm-hmm. I looked up, I think, the records of the papers of the division commander of the 26th Infantry Division. I said, okay. I wrote them an email in English, and I said, this is what, the archive says you have. This is what your finding aid says you have. Could you give me a little more detail? And they wrote back to me and said, yeah, this is what it contains, and it comes to about 43 pages, and for X number of euros, we will Xerox that and send it to you. Mm-hmm. That's awesome.
That's simple.
So let's make some medicine, as John Wayne would say in True Grit. And then the main German archive is, of course, the Federal Military Archive in Freiburg. And they also have digitized some of their records. Again, you have to hunt around. The website is very useful. Mm-hmm. And so that's where you would go. And then Potsdam is really good because for World War I, because so many records were destroyed, you have to go to regimental histories. Every regiment had a history. Okay. Written. Including some by some fairly prestigious, German military historians, Gerhard Ritter, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And so Potsdam has the full collection of regimental histories. You can get some in this country, usually like the Guards Regiment histories, that kind of thing. These really thick tomes. Mm-hmm. You can find in this country. I know 42nd Street, the New York Public Library has a number of them. Hmm. But Potsdam has like the full collection.
I'm speaking with Richard DiNardo, author of Turning Points. You can find more of his books by Googling his name or looking for his books on Amazon. If you like this podcast, Military History Inside Out, please rate it on whatever podcast feed you're listening to it on. Please follow, like, and comment on my website, warscholar.org or militaryhistorypodcast.com, on YouTube at warscholar1945, on Twitter and Facebook at warscholar, and on Instagram at Chris Alvarez Warscholar. If you like sci-fi, fantasy, and horror, please listen to my podcast Full Contact Nerd, also located at chrisalvarez.com or fullcontactnerd.com. If you like outer space, business, technology, and policy, please listen to my podcast Spacewalks Money Talks, also located at spacewalksmoneytalks.com. Now back to the podcast. Were you able to visit any of the World War I sites that you write about in the book?
Regrettably not. There is actually a tour company which actually did tours of World War I Eastern Front battlefields, mm-hmm. But it's frightfully expensive.
Ah, okay. So what part of this research was most enjoyable for you?
Oh, God. Coming up with all kinds of interesting little items. And, of course, the letters of people, especially Corps commanders, a guy like Robert Koch, mm-hmm. Who was like writing his wife like every other day. Mm-hmm. And his letters were all typed up in the archives in Freiburg very, very nicely. And so he's a good informant. And then you have really kind of amusing things. For example, when the Russians captured Przemysl in March of 1915, mm-hmm. they captured a lot of guns, that were part of the fortress's equipment. Mm-hmm. These being Austrian. And so when Przemysl was recaptured by Mackenson's 11th Army at the end of May 1915, mm-hmm. it was occupied by the 11th Bavarian Division. So they capture these guns, and they're sending them back to Munich as like war trophies. And of course, the Austrians are screwing their heads into this and saying, "Wait a minute, that's our property." and so the German liaison officer at AOK, August von Kramon, is writing to Falkenhayn, asking him to ask Mackensen, can you get the Bavarians to give the stuff back to the Austrians?
Wow.
I never did find out how that whole issue was resolved. It was very, very interesting.
What did you find that most surprised you as you did the research?
Ooh, that's a good question. That most surprised me. Well, on the Russian side, it's very interesting. It's worth noting that after the Tsar decides to relieve Grand Duke Nicholas, and send them off to the Caucasus. Interestingly enough, the Tsar's Stavka worked a little bit better than the Grand Duke's Stavka did. In a sense, it was much better equipped with communications equipment, that kind of thing, and so on. And so in that regard, now the only trouble is that the Tsar himself was not exactly a model of military decisiveness. So he really, so that the single point of failure was the chief of staff, Alexiev, who was there. And also, it was also kind of interesting on the German side to see how, a couple of things. Number one, again, this is very interesting, the use of military attachés for intelligence purposes is an interesting story that still has to be written. I think that's one thing. Another was it was very interesting. Another interesting aspect to look at is if you look at who Adolf Hitler's principal operational level commanders were. In other words, the armed group commanders and some of the army commanders. For example, Rundstedt, Bach, Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb. They all have one thing in common. They all spent extensive time on the Eastern Front in World War I. So they were accustomed to mobile warfare.
Ah, I see. Okay.
So again, you got to. It's interesting to look at what happened to these people. Subsequently, Bach had been Mackensen's operations officer at his headquarters for the 1915 campaigns. And Lieb had been he was the chief of staff, if I'm not mistaken, for the Bavarian 11th Division commander, Paul Ritter von Knoissel. And Rundstedt had spent time on the Eastern Front and was on the staff of the Governor General of Warsaw, Hans Hartwig von Basler, which was again, it's very interesting. And then you'll also kind of get an appreciation for how people communicate. For example, Conrad is a man of the 19th century. If he's going to discuss a major decision regarding a let's say coalition warfare, he wants a personal meeting. And then after that, the next day he'll write a memo, a lengthy memo, in this kind of florid 19th century style, which will often come to conclusions that were precisely the opposite of what had been agreed to at the meeting. Falkenhayn had a lot more traveling to do because he had to divide his time between. By late 1950, he had divided his time between the Eastern Front, the Western Front, and Serbia. So he regards personal meetings as these time-consuming things that he would like to avoid. So he preferred to use telephone.
Okay.
And that was another thing that was surprising, is that particularly in the case of Mackensen, how much of the business of his headquarters really ran on telephone. And so basically there was one officer in his headquarters, and certainly I was able to document this for the Serbian campaign book, a Captain Dunst, who spent most of his day on the telephone, basically receiving reports and issuing orders. And then written ones could be filled out, and sent later, but a lot of the business was done by telephone. And in fact, if you read German regimental histories carefully, for example, the crossing of the Danube, the crossing of the Seine, that kind of thing, the regimental history will mention the name of the private often who brings the telephone line across.
Oh, really? Huh.
And if you look at the surviving German orders at corps and division level, the end of it will say, telephonic contact with higher headquarters to be established by, and it gives a date and a time.
Interesting.
And in fact, what Francois, the commander of the 41st Reserve Corps, did before the Gorlitza operation, even though he's on Austro-Hungarian territory, basically, any civilian found near a German telephone line was subject to an immediate death sentence.
Wow.
Which was one way of securing one's communications. But,
yeah. Was there a particular, and I know there are a lot of things you can't answer when you're doing this research because there are gaps in the record, but was there a particular question that you had a lot of difficulty getting to conclusion on and finally did, or perhaps you really researched it and didn't get an answer and still would like one?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I'd like a little bit more of is the details of the Posen conference on 2 July 1915, when basically Hindenburg and Ludendorff walk into a bureaucratic ambush, brilliantly engineered by Falkenhayn, concerning how Russian Poland was going to be taken. Hindenburg and Ludendorff, more Ludendorff than Hindenburg, wanted a much wider envelopment with Pincer's meeting at Minsk, and Falkenhayn and I think probably Mackensen as well regarded this as logistically simply not feasible, and they were right. But the precise details of how the meeting went, in other words, who said what, we don't have a, if you will, kind of a stenographic record like we do of, let's say, like the Wannsee conference. The infamous Wannsee conference. We don't have any kind of written record of that, which would have been kind of fun to read, because we do have an extensive file to the late summer and early fall of correspondence between Oberost, which was Hindenburg and Ludendorff's headquarters, the Supreme Command in the East, and OHL, and you can see kind of like the snarkiness coming through between Falkenhayn and Hindenburg and Ludendorff.
Okay. So I know that historical research doesn't necessarily lend itself to emotional impacts or feelings, but was there anything that you came across that had either a very negative or very positive emotional impact on you?
It's difficult to say. I mean, you see, for example, people. There was one interesting thing, which I saw, which was also captured in a photograph, where Robert Koch, the commander before he commanded 10th Corps, he was commanding the 10th Reserve Corps. Before he was commanding 10th Reserve Corps, he was commander of the 1st Corps, German 1st Corps, at the Battle of Masurian Lakes. And he recounts in a letter to his wife how he met 3 survivors of the battle, 2 Russian prisoners and 1 German reservist. They were all roughly like 14 or 15 years old.
Oh, wow.
And he had a picture taken with them right outside his Corps headquarters. And I've seen the photo. It's in his papers. And it's basically him standing with the German in the center and the 2 Russians on the side, and then oddly enough, it looks like an aide of his is kind of poking his head through the doorway, kind of almost like photobombing the shot. But it's a very, very peculiar photograph. There's also another fun one which shows you how people can act. Even German generals have kind of wacky senses of humor. There's a picture of the advance in Galicia, kind of in the late summer, And Koch, now commanding the 10th Reserve Corps, is involved in this. And they're on the estate of some nobleman, and it's a picture of him and his staff with a captured Russian officer who was a Cossack. And basically, Koch and his chief of staff, they've wheeled out this giant stuffed bear. Okay, on its hind legs, and they're linking arms with the bear.
Okay.
I mean, it's a very, very strange photo, and you know, it's very nice, like reading Koch's letters to his wife, and you know, so on. It's similar to reading, let's say, an American Civil War, soldiers' letters home, that kind of thing. You get a lot of that.
Has anyone done extensive research on his letters and written on it, or is your work?
As far as I know, Koch, there is no biographer of Robert Koch. And we actually do have several Corps commanders who did have like extensive diaries, memoirs, letters. Koch would be one. Karl Litzmann, who plays an important role in the Second Masurian Lakes, and in the Fall campaign in 1915 in Poland, would be another one. So there is some good biographical work to be done there as well. And another thing that I've tried to clear up is this, and I've been on this now for several books. I have an article coming out next year in War and History on this, is the relationship between commanders and chiefs of staff in the German army. A lot of people, I think, very carelessly kind of extrapolate from the relationship between Hindenburg and Ludendorff, and sort of impose that on the rest of the German army, to suppose that the commanders were all just frontmen for their chiefs of staff who did all their thinking. And, you know, Zeke was a very able chief of staff, but, you know, let's you know, I mean, you know, essentially working at Quantico for the past 22 years, I've gotten a chance to work for a number of generals in various capacities at times. We don't give colonels lobotomies when we make them generals. Okay? And these guys are smart. Mackensen himself, for all of his weird appearance, because he liked, he enjoyed, he was an ardent cavalryman, and his initial unit, the one that really held his heart, was the Second Life Hussars, which was always famous for its distinctive Hussars busby, big fur busby with the death's head. And, you know, and it was a uniform he liked to wear. That was the uniform he regularly wore, and that the regulations kind of allowed him to. And so, with his big handlebar mustache and his deep-set eyes, it does give him the appearance of something from an earlier age. And he himself was described, he was a very popular man in Germany. He was described as kind of like the reincarnation of Marshal Blucher. Well, that's a little unfair to Mackensen. You know, Blucher was a very inspiring commander, very fiery, that kind of thing. He was also a certified loon. I mean, he thought the world was flat. He thought all kinds of weird things. Mackensen's a thoroughgoing professional who had done a turn on the general staff. And Zeke acknowledges that in a letter to his wife that Mackensen had very few what he called vanities. In other words, these kind of personal idiosyncrasies that had to be indulged. And he also described as a man of very wide intelligence, both of a theoretical and practical nature. Likewise, you have people like Max von Gollwitz, Otto von Below. Again, these are Eastern Front commanders who are not the playthings of their chiefs of staff, for God's sake. It's about time we kind of ditched this notion.
Interesting. Okay. So what do you hope, so apart from being a history of the Eastern Front in 1915 and filling any historical gaps, what else do you hope the book will do?
Sell well.
Yes, definitely.
No, I mean it kind of builds on what I've been doing before, and hopefully people will like it and read it. And it sort of led me into what I'm working on currently, which will be the next book, which will be due in 2024.
Okay.
At least the manuscript is due in 2024, and that's back in 2005, I produced Germany and the Axis Powers, which is a study of Germany and coalition warfare in the Second World War. The next book is going to be the prequel to that, called Germany and the Central Powers. So hopefully, for example, we don't have in English, for example, a really good full-length treatment of things like, for example, the German military mission to Ottoman Turkey. There was one book, I think, by Azar Gat, but that's still in German back in the 70s. Sean McMeekin touches a little bit on it in his Berlin to Baghdad book, but there really isn't. And we do have a fair amount of source material for that in the form of the memoirs of people like Lehman von Zonders. Several other officers wrote memoirs or essays and on this, and we also have some good stuff coming out on the Turks now in English, thanks to the efforts of my old friend and colleague Ed Erickson, who has done a lot of interesting stuff on the Turkish army, including a lot of archival research.
So German efforts in the Eastern Front, how much were they affected, and let's stick to 1915, how much were they affected by what was going on the Western Front or on other fronts?
Oh, there's quite a bit. There's a lot of interplay between the fronts, which is why also 1915 is very interesting. If you look at the problems that a guy like Falkenhayn has to deal with, they're a lot more complex, I would argue, than, let's say, what the Allies are dealing with. So, for example, every time there's an attack on the Western Front, there are concerns about, well, do we have to pull forces back from the east? If things quiet enough, I can thin forces out. So, for example, once they created the strategic reserve of about 14 divisions, Falkenhayn committed the bulk of that allowed Falkenhayn to build up a force of 8 divisions for the Gorlice offensive, and most of those were drawn from the Western Front. And that's very interesting too, because then what you have to do is you have to retrain those troops for mobile warfare.
Give them a different mindset.
Yeah, exactly. And then likewise, for the invasion of Serbia, once the military convention is signed, the convention says that Germany is going to provide X number of divisions, Austro-Hungary is going to provide X number of divisions, and then Bulgaria is going to provide X number of divisions. And Germany and Austro-Hungary would attack within 30 days of the signing of the convention. Bulgaria would attack within 35 days. And of course, those troops got to come from somewhere. And then what happens is Austria says, well, owing to events on the Eastern Front, namely the Black-Yellow offensive, which I discuss a little bit in the late summer and early fall of the campaign, is eating up so much resources. Conrad has to write Falklands that we really can't provide the number of troops we kind of promised according to the convention. And so Falkenhayn, through gritted teeth, says, okay, we'll make up the difference. So, and again, you got to pry troops from over Ostend. And there were times when Falkenhayn would ask for forces from Hindenburg, and Hindenburg was perfectly happy to tell him to get stuffed, And so it was very difficult to pry troops out from commanders who wanted to hang on to them in the worst possible way. So there's a lot of complexity that goes on. That also meant that operations had to be of relatively short duration. So, for example, again, I think Serbia provides a good one here. Weather is causing delays, and OHL is really fretting about all this sort of thing. And then where commanders position themselves is interesting too, because Falkenhayn divides his time between Metsieres, which is where OHL is for the Western Front, Pless, which is about an hour's drive from Teschen, which is the site of the Austro-Hungarian High Command headquarters. And then further, also occasionally going down into Hungary for close observation of the invasion of Serbia. Operation against Serbia once that was underway. And of course, all that, you think about how much train travel Falkenhayn has to do. It's got to be pretty exhausting.
So just stepping back to the example that you just mentioned a few minutes ago, it's always interesting. You look at a battle and the outcome, and you try to figure out what happened. But then when you step back and you realize that the personnel and material in place was decided by a few men writing a document and signing it, which the orders to move this here and there, you forget it's just a few guys pushing paper around.
So it's a few people who have to make critical decisions, and then and obviously knowing that obviously lives are going to be lost. And that was something that World War I commanders kind of took for granted, as a French general, Charles Mangin, put it: if you attack, you're going to lose a lot of men. If you defend, you're going to lose a lot of men. If you move, you're going to lose a lot of men. So no matter what we do, we're going to lose a lot of men.
Yeah.
That's the reality that you have to deal with. Although, again, another bogus notion too is this whole business about chateau generalship and so on. So a lot of this is kind of foolish. For example, there were 73 British generals were killed in World War I. 71 German generals were killed, including one who was done in by a lance
Oh, wow.
in a cavalry skirmish by a Cossack.
Wow.
And 54 French generals.
Yeah. So
and the Russians had a number of their commanders killed or captured.
Yeah, they were out there fighting.
Yeah.
Did you have any difficulties getting? You mentioned the word count, the limit. Did you have any other difficulties getting the book finished or published?
No. I was already under contract with ABC with Prager, which is an imprint of ABC Clio.
Okay.
I had worked with them before. They like what I do. They gave me kind of carte blanche, and I usually I pride myself on getting my stuff in on time or early. The biggest problems are always doing stuff like getting maps, photos. Photos are not bad. There are some good sources out there. For example, the Library of Congress has a collection of photos from a defunct news service, the Bain collection. And so there's no copyright.
Right.
And you can literally download the photos off the internet. Very easy. Maps is always a bigger problem. The maps I got for this book were out of the German official history. Again, it's over 70 years old. So there's no copyright issue, but sometimes they don't reproduce as precisely as a publisher would like.
Right.
And so on. And so that's always a problem. And I also the other biggest issue is, of course, the doing the index. I do my own index.
Ah, okay. And that's I'm sure that's time consuming.
Yeah, I mean I could pay someone to do it, but A, I'm kind of cheap, and B, it's one of the most important parts of the book. So for anyone who, when I use a book to do research, the first thing I do is I'll look at the index. Yeah. And so, a detailed index is worth its weight in platinum.
Yeah.
So therefore, I always make it an effort to do that sort of thing, and therefore I do the index myself. And it is very time consuming, to be sure.
But as you say, important.
Yeah.
Where can people find you on the web? Do you have a web page, social media, anything like that?
I'm not what you would call a big social media person. I'm relatively easy to track down. I mean, I'm a member of the Society for Military History.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm relatively easy to find, but I'm not. I mean, I'm on Facebook about maybe once a month.
Yeah.
I don't tweet.
Mm-hmm.
I think at times Twitter makes people stupid, but this is neither here nor there.
So
this is me.
So people could just Google your name if they wanted to find out what you're working on and that sort of thing.
Yeah, or what I've done, or they can Amazon me.
Okay.
Because all my books are on Amazon.
Okay, good. That's all the questions I have. Do you have any final thoughts or words?
No, I mean it's fun to write. It was fun to write. On average, it takes me about 5 years to do a book.
Wow.
And although between the Serbia book and this one, I also worked on a very extensive military history, institutional history of the Imperial German Army, with a friend of mine, Dan Hughes, called Imperial Germany in War, which I would urge people to have a look at.
Okay, yeah.
But writing is always enjoyable, and researching is always enjoyable. I go to Germany. I like traveling to Germany when I can to do research. I have a number of friends over there, that kind of thing, and so
Cool. Yeah, it sounds like a really interesting book. Some cool stuff in there. Cool personalities and all kinds of little tidbits. It sounds like.
Yeah. The personalities are what makes it so enjoyable. I mean, you can't make this stuff up.
Yeah. Well, thank you for speaking with me.
Oh, my pleasure.
Thank you for listening. You can find more podcasts like this on your favorite podcast feed under the title Military History Inside Out. That includes Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. One great way to support me is to rate my podcasts, either good or bad. You can find more great military history information at warscholar.org, on YouTube at Warscholar 1945, on Facebook at Warscholar, on Instagram at Chris Alvarez Warscholar, and on Twitter at Warscholar. Please support me by following me on those sites and liking my videos. If you like to read, don't forget to sign up for my weekly newsletter where I recommend newly published books. The subscription box is on my webpage. Thank you.